Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we are talking about some of the most surprising things we found when we started our 1L year. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Alison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started.
Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're talking about the most surprising things we found about 1L year. So, Lee, what did you find most surprising when you were starting law school?
Well, the first thing I realized when I started law school is it felt like I was back in high school. There were lockers, there was orientation, everybody had new backpacks.
Yeah, they really thought about.
Yeah, it just really felt a little like cliquish. It was about, we had this fair where there were all these clubs, and it was a little weird to me, I'll be honest. I didn't love orientation. I was a little disillusioned with the experience, and I just kept reminding myself that I had wanted to do this. I had come from work, so, I wasn't coming just from undergrad, and I felt a little bit out of place with some of the people who were straight out of undergrad. It took me a minute to find my people, so my kickoff to law school was not that great. I settled in, I made friends, I, owned my experience, and I enjoyed law school, and I was happy with it, but it started out rocky, I'll be honest.
Yeah, I kind of agree. I feel like I was just totally overwhelmed in the beginning by just the crush of people and all of these activities. And partly this might have been that I moved to New York City, which also has its own kind of crushing overload of just stuff. But it just felt like there was stuff going on all the time, and that I had to figure it all out, and I had to figure it out all at once. And the whole first semester just felt kind of manic. Mm-hmm. It was always just like there was some event I could be going to, and I wanted to go to a lot of them, but it just seemed like it was just a lot.
Yeah, and then every single academic thing I did took me forever. And I consider myself a pretty fast reader, a good writer, but, going through those early legal cases, it's just like slogging through molasses.
Yeah, I do remember that because I've always thought I'm a quick reader. Mm-hmm. And then I did at some point calculate my average reading speed, and I think it was 10 pages an hour, which is actually, I've now learned, pretty standard. Mm-hmm. And I was just like, are you joking? I don't read 10 pages an hour. I can read a 100-page book in a few hours, but that's just not the way that you have to read this material, and just the volume of it and the consistency, day after day after day, it just becomes kind of crushing.
It does. And I think, you can take heart. It does get easier the longer you do it. But I think those first, few assignments, first few weeks, everything just feels so heavy. The first LRW assignment, it feels like you're writing in a different language. It doesn't feel authentic to you. It can feel clunky, and it can be very frustrating.
Yeah, and I was surprised by how carefully we ended up having to parse just everything. I guess this shouldn't be surprising, but I remember the first day of torts, and I love my torts class, and I love my torts professor, but we spent the entire class on a case that was maybe 2 pages. Mm-hmm. I don't even know if it was 2 pages. It might have been 1 page. And, you think, how can you spend 90 minutes on 1 page? Yeah. But that was pretty normal.
And you also ended up, I think in the beginning, reading all these old cases.
Yeah, I remember this being a very old case. And we're just like, what does this even mean?
You don't even know what it means. Penoyer versus Neff, and you hear all these kind of iconic names of these cases that aren't necessarily even good law anymore.
Yeah, they're kind of there just to make you parse them carefully and figure out, what all these weird words like replevin even mean.
Yeah, which you will know what replevin means, but you won't on your first day of law school.
And you probably won't remember it years later.
No.
I'm like, I'd remember something about property.
I think it's a remedy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Something, yeah.
So, but I also found that it's like you had to slog through these old English cases about really random things, and you're kind of trying to dig out all of this information. And then all of a sudden, kind of once you get kind of your sea legs, then you start reading more modern cases and you realize, oh, this isn't as torturous when it's not written in 18th century English.
Yeah, but then typically your assignments get longer.
Well,
so you end up having the same volume of material that you're reading day after day after day. It was just, I remember, a very, very high volume of reading.
Yeah.
And I'm a person who reads a lot.
Yeah. I think the other thing that is tough about the beginning of law school is you realize that you have to figure most stuff out on your own. They're not going to walk you through it.
Yeah, and I think that is a huge shift. Nobody's going to tell you kind of how to do things. I mean, there may be some, a couple of workshops or something that kind of suggest maybe you want to make an outline. But nobody's going to tell you kind of how to do this, and nobody's really going to sit down and teach you the actual material, which I think is surprising for a lot of people. You think, oh, okay, I'm taking, tort law. They're going to tell me what tort law is. And that's just not, nobody's going to probably sit down and say, okay, there are these things called intentional torts, and then here's a list of them, and here's what each one means. And then there's this thing called negligence, and here's how that works. I mean, we could basically do an hour and give you like first semester tort law. Nobody's going to do that for you.
No, they really aren't. And nobody is also going to teach you, like, how does a case get to the Supreme Court?
Yeah, I remember midway through my first semester at Columbia Law School realizing I actually did not understand the federal and state court systems, and I didn't really quite understand, what case was binding precedent on what other cases. And I did not feel like I could ask anyone at the school about it at that point.
Which is why that is part of our Start Law School Right course.
Because I do not want other people to be in that position.
Right.
Because it is a little disconcerting when you're halfway through Civ Pro at an Ivy League law school and you realize you do not actually understand how the court system works.
Yeah, I remember sitting in my criminal law class and somebody asking my professor, well into the semester, like how a habeas corpus petition could get to the Supreme Court for like a state case. And now I'm kind of like, well, of course you know that answer. But a lot of 1Ls were kind of like, oh, don't call on me.
Yeah,
I don't know what that answer is.
That is a good question.
Yeah, that is a good question. And I think that a lot of these things that professors assume you know.
Right. I mean, they assume you took a civics class at some point. But, I mean, who did really at this point?
Well, I took a civics class. I can honestly tell you that was not in my civics class.
Well, I mean, and it also would have been like high school if you did take it.
Right. Do you know what I did in my high school civics class? I got asked to prom in my high school civics class. That's how much of a joke. That's how much of a joke. That and my other friend used to eat these like banana muffins that she used to get at the coffee shop down the street. So we'd eat banana muffins, and I got asked to the prom.
Yeah, I think in my case they canceled civics like before I took it. So I never took it.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think
it was rural North Carolina. You're like, you don't need to know about that. Don't worry too much about politics.
Yeah, I think our teacher got sick or something, and we had like a long-term sub. I mean, it was a joke. It was a joke.
Yeah, so the point being, there are these things that will probably be assumed that you know that you do not know.
Right.
And there's no harm in not knowing them. You just need to find out about them.
Yep.
So, you can do our Start Law School Right course and we'll just tell you about them. Or you can go, basically to Wikipedia and it'll probably give you a pretty decent explanation of the basics of the court system. Or you can Google any of these things. Or you can, ask someone who seems sympathetic, like maybe your legal writing instructor or something.
Yeah. So what about professors? How did you feel when you started interacting with professors?
Well, that was really surprising to me. I had a master's in architecture, and there from day one, we were really treated as, people who were intelligent, who had interesting things to think about and say, who were doing work that deserved to be taken seriously, and that we might have ideas that were novel or interesting. And that is just really not how law school works. There is a definite hierarchy. The formality can be very surprising in class. You're generally going to be addressed by your last name, which is very strange. Coming from California, we're just like, what? All the California people are kind of in the back of the room being like, Miss Monahan, why are they calling me that? That's my mother,
Yeah.
So there is a definite degree of hierarchy and formality, and I think this can be really surprising for people who are coming from typically, more of a non-traditional background. So you may be older, you may have had another career, different graduate study, and it can be really shocking when suddenly you're basically treated like you are kind of an idiot, and that you know nothing, and that you're just going to be this empty vessel that they're going to pour legal knowledge into.
And I think one of the things that I learned is that some professors also have a class persona and an outside of class persona.
Right.
And I think the most intimidating professors in the classroom oftentimes were much, much more approachable and friendly in office hours. You just had to be willing to go to those office hours. And I think that it can feel like your professors want nothing to do with you in class if you feel like they're being dismissive, or they don't want to talk to you after class, or they maybe are somewhat harsh if you're not prepared or get a question wrong. But if you go to them after hours one-on-one and are struggling and are earnestly trying to get help, usually they're pretty helpful.
Yeah, they definitely tend to be more relaxed. I mean, they're still not going to be like buddy with you probably in office hours, but they're typically more relaxed, and you can actually, I think professors like it when you come to office hours. They respect that. Shows you're trying, shows you're interested.
Yep.
And the same thing, I think assuming you're participating in class and looking like you're paying attention. I mean, if you're the person in the back of the room who's like clearly, playing Fortnite or something, and then like not making eye contact and refusing to talk when you're called on, they're probably not going to be that nice to you in office hours.
Right.
But if you're a person who looks like they're trying, they're probably going to be like, oh, okay, I'm going to give this person a break.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it was also weird not getting to pick my classes.
Yeah.
Like I was
totally bizarre.
You just kindergarten.
Yeah, you just show up and they're like, okay, so you're going to be going to torts class at 8 a.m. on Tuesday and Thursday. And you're like, well, I'm not really a morning person. And they're like, yeah, too bad for you.
And then you have this weird 3-hour block in the middle of the day where you get to like do your reading and eat lunch. I mean, it's very strange. Because, if you've been used to having a lot of autonomy, you're like, but I like to work out in the middle of the day, or I like to do other things in the middle of the day. They're like, no.
Or just like, I don't feel like taking this class. It's like, well, too bad.
Too bad. Real property. Enjoy.
Yeah, you're going to be taking that class. Also, Columbia wasn't super strict on the sections. They did mix it up a little bit sometimes, but I feel like that whole thing is just super bizarre, too, that you're just like taking all your classes with the same people.
Oh, yeah. And it is really weird because then you'll graduate and you've almost never met some of the people.
Oh, yeah. And like if somebody's not in your first year class, I mean, you can meet them in orientation and be like the best of friends for a week or two, and then you're never going to see them again for 3 years.
It's really strange. Yeah, it's very strange. And it also was weird because most of my professors did call us by our last names, and we would meet somebody and you're like, Lauren?
Yeah, you don't even know people's first names.
I know. And then
really
they're like, oh, that's Smith. And you're like, oh, Smith. Oh,
yeah,
I know who you are.
Miss Burgess.
Right,
yeah, I know
exactly.
her. Like, was her name Leah?
Right,
Lisa?
It's really funny. Yeah. So it's a different world in that way. I think another thing that's a little odd about the law school experience when you get started is grades are all of a sudden maybe more important than they've ever felt to you.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that was really shocking. Because again, like from architecture school, I don't think I've ever even seen my transcript. I have literally no idea what my GPA was. It was not relevant to anything. No one was going to hire me based on my transcript. In that case, they were hiring you based on your work, and they were never going to hire me based on that. So,
you went to law school.
Yes, I went to law school. It didn't matter that like I'd gotten an A in structures. Literally, no one cared. And suddenly in law school, from day one, it's like, oh, the grades, the curve. The you're not going to get this, you're not going to get that. Your life is over if you. Nobody's going to get straight A's, and the curve is really harsh, and like everybody's competing for the same few like good grades, or at least it can feel that way. And it just, I feel like it's different from most undergraduates too, because most undergrads are not like on a curve. Occasionally in the sciences and engineering and things like that, but typically, if you had a class of 30 people, like 25 of them could get some type of A, and that's not the case anymore.
Yeah. The other thing that I thought was interesting was the drinking and the socializing and how kind of formulaic it was.
Oh, yeah, like the bar review every Thursday. Yeah. And just like, ugh.
And I had an 8 or 9 a.m. It felt like 8 a.m. Maybe it was a 9 a.m. contracts class on Friday mornings. And I think I went to one bar night. It was just like, I cannot do this. And I used to go out in my day, but I was like, I cannot be functioning at like 9 a.m. tomorrow morning.
The one good thing about my class schedule is I basically never had Friday classes, which worked out well for the Thursday night bar review, which we went to basically every week. And
if I hadn't had a 9 a.m. contracts class, I would have probably been there too. But
yeah, and certainly, in New York, like people drank like I've never seen people drink, and let's be honest, this results in a lot of like issues for a number of people. A lot of substance abuse problems start in law school. just something to be aware of. You're not as young as you used to be, and nobody probably needs to be binge drinking multiple times a week anyway.
Yeah, and I think that I went to, let's see, how old was I when I started law school? Like 25. I think I was 26, I think, when I started law school. And so, I had done most of my kind of real partying like before then. Things were starting to calm down a little bit. I'd been working, a lot. But I think that all of a sudden too, you're out maybe with people who are 22. And if you're not 22, it's hard to party with people who are 22. It can be, depending on if you've been doing yoga instead of going out to bars.
No, I think at a lot of schools, the drinking can be pretty debauched.
Yeah. So, if that's not your jam, you really want to find another way to bond with people. But I think it was just surprising to me how, what do you mean you're not going to bar night? Or what do you mean you're not doing
it was
this?
Also very, very pervasive. I mean, I remember, basically every event they had at the law school, there were people coming around with trays of alcohol. And I think for a number of people, that can be very problematic.
Yeah. So you just got to be aware of it. Partake, don't partake, but at least know that that's part of the culture. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So everybody else has started talking about summer jobs. We hadn't even taken finals yet, which was kind of super weird.
Yeah, I mean, the whole summer job thing starts really early. And again, you may not realize that summer job kind of is important. Also, you're not really allowed to get any real help immediately. I think they've moved these deadlines up a little bit. But, I remember there was all this stuff in the air about you're applying for this fellowship or that fellowship. They're giving out money for this or that. I'm like, it's October. What are we talking about here? Yeah. And, you couldn't really get a lot of assistance. And it just became this, I felt very high stress situation. And, I ended up applying for jobs on December 1st in the middle of exams. And, that was super weird. And I remember getting a call back from one of those places I had applied to in San Francisco, and I had literally got the notice from them the day that I arrived back in New York City from the winter break. And I was like, wait, you want me to fly, turn around and literally in 2 days and fly back to San Francisco to do an interview? And they're like, yeah, no big deal, right? And I was like, this is so weird. You just want me to fly across the country for this interview, and I was just there. And also, why are you even, talking to me, Yeah. And then, I remember people came on campus to interview, and it was this, again, just this sort of bizarro thing where, you're going to pay me how much to, do this job where I just go out and, eat and drink a lot?
And I think if you're going the public interest route after your 1L year, a lot of those job opportunities don't really come up until the spring, but even they can be highly competitive. I mean, if you want to work at a U.S. Attorney's office or a DA's office or a PD's office or for a judge or whatever opportunities may be available, I mean, those can be highly competitive. You should be networking and trying to get somebody to pull your resume out of the stack of people who want to go do that kind of work. I think there are a lot of opportunities, and people can get pretty down if they don't get their first couple of opportunities. But once you get some grades and you've been networking, it can be easier to find something a little later on. You just have to stay open to that and don't, get demoralized. And you have to also consider whether or not you can work an unpaid job or if you need to make money, because those are also two big differences. And only you can answer that by looking at your bank account and figuring out what you can take on.
Right. And I think first semester, all the job stuff just becomes this kind of background buzz when the reality is you can't actually do that much about it at that point. I mean, there are things that you should be paying attention to. For example, if there are funding deadlines for public interest work and that's what you think you want to do, you want to make sure you apply and try to meet those deadlines. But really the second semester is when a lot of this starts to make a lot more sense. And that's when you might have career fairs going on and public interest career fairs and people start hiring. I think the first semester is just this kind of source of stress that you can't do that much about. So it just ends up people just kind of spin around and try to do things, but there's not really that much to do typically. And it just gets really weird. And it just seemed weird to be even worrying about this in the fall of what I was going to do the next summer.
Yeah. I think, outside of jobs, just generally that first year, it can take a while to really understand the culture of the school that you're at. And, I think for me, my undergrad, I went to a small liberal arts college down in Southern California, and we all lived on campus. We lived in campus or on campus-sponsored housing for all 4 years. It was very close knit. Everybody was together all the time. And then you're in law school, and I had friends who commuted from 30 minutes away to come to law school, and that seemed kind of odd to me. So you're kind of making friends, and then you make some friends, and you realize they're not around very much, which was definitely a different situation. We weren't all living on campus and things like that. Different schools kind of have different percentages of students who are kind of commuter students versus who are, more of a tight-knit community. Different schools have different reputations for kind of arrogance and competition and various other things. And so it can take a while to feel like, you're kind of navigating the cultural space of your school.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for us, like most people did live on or near campus because Columbia owned all of the buildings in the area and they gave you a better deal typically.
Sure.
And it was also just easier because you just signed up and they told you where you were going to be living. But yeah, I mean, I found a number of my classmates just very weird and mysterious. I had avoided the whole idea of like any Ivy League school, kind of like the plague for my entire life. Like I refused to apply to any Ivy undergrads. I was just like, I don't want, these people are not my people. Like this is, and as it turned out, probably they're not. And so I think different schools do have different tones. I mean, being in New York and being at like this very high pressure Ivy League school, coming from California was definitely different. I'd been living in San Francisco. I'd gone to Berkeley. I mean, those two schools are pretty different.
Yeah, there are some pretty polar opposites of culture.
Yeah, so
there.
my two grad schools, Berkeley and Columbia, about as far apart on the spectrum in a lot of ways as you could possibly get. Berkeley was like, super like loosey-goosey. There were pretty much no requirements for anything. My third year of architecture school, I decided I didn't feel like doing a building project, and I just had to get a few professors to kind of sign off on that, and they were fine with it. And I wrote a paper. It was stuff like that. Like that does not really fly, particularly your first year of law school. I mean, in later years, obviously, you can sculpt your experience more. But that first year is just very regimented. You don't have a lot of choice. I think that can be surprising if you are coming from, having worked and deciding where to live and deciding how to spend your time. It might feel less weird. But even from college, I mean, I think most people's college experiences, particularly their senior year, are going to be a lot more flexible than that first year of law school.
That is so true.
Which is not flexible.
Yeah. So one thing I think you can take away from this conversation, though, is don't get demoralized if you feel like you've walked into campus and it's a little overwhelming or you haven't found your people. I think it can take a little bit of time to find, your folks, the people who your experience is going to be similar to, or you're going to bond with, or you're going to be able to do this study group stuff with. But that's not necessarily all going to happen on day one. And it's okay. Take a deep breath, keep meeting people, and you'll probably find where you fit in this equation.
Sure. And I think there's a lot of posturing with people, just saying and doing kind of crazy things to make themselves feel better, and just recognizing that for what it is. And people just do some really bizarre things. Yeah. I think personally out of insecurity, but you definitely, people were not necessarily very nice all of the time. I mean, you hear stories and like back in the day, people tearing pages out of the books in the library. And then, I remember once going and doing, I think it was our first we had some legal research assignment we had to do at the library, and literally there were pages missing. And I was like, who are these people?
So weird.
Seriously? This is not just back in the myth of the paper chase? I mean, I don't know if somebody watched the paper chase and thought it would be cool to take some of the pages.
So weird.
I mean, I saw some really, really weird stuff.
Yeah.
But
that being said, you have some great friends from law school.
I do.
That you are, that you're still close to. I enjoy meeting them and being in their circle. So, you can find your people.
No, exactly. And I think it's important that you give yourself that time. I mean, I don't think too many people show up and then the first week are like, yeah, I feel so comfortable and confident. And this is the easiest thing I've ever done. I have all my buddies. People do not necessarily, even if they appear that that's what they're doing, that's not really what they're doing.
Yeah.
I was later friends with people who I would have thought totally had it together those first weeks. And then later on, I found out all kinds of different things about them. It was just like, wow, okay, you were really a much bigger mess than I realized.
Yeah, which is really such a story of life.
It is a story of life.
Yeah.
So, I think those people who seem Particularly I think this can be an issue if you're not somebody who grew up in, if you find yourself at one of these like very fancy places and you're not someone who grew up in that environment, that can be really challenging. Mm-hmm. It can also be absolutely fascinating. Mm-hmm. I remember I had a friend who had grown up in like a pretty rough neighborhood in, I think, Seattle or something. And, he and I would just sit on the couch sometimes and just laugh and be like, how did we end up in this scenario with these people? Like, these are like, heiresses and just like, people who like, who are these people? And you'd find out, occasionally like who someone's grandfather was or something. And you're like, wait, what? Like, how am I in a class with this person? Like, and we just thought it was kind of hysterical.
But I think what's interesting, you make a point of kind of this idea of imposter syndrome, which I think, so many of us have felt that at some point. I remember when I got my first job at a consulting firm out of college, and I was at this training in a high-rise downtown overlooking the Ferry Building, which ironically I go to now all the time to go to the farmers market. But at that point, I'm like, standing up there, and they've laid our laptops on this table, and we're all supposed to go to our laptops. And I was looking out the window and remember saying to myself, they do know I'm like 4 years out of a small high school in a small town in the Central Valley, right? Did they know that? Do they know that, like, yeah, I have now this credential and I went to a good school and I did well academically, but do they really know like who I am? Because I think most of us, feel that in some way. And then, I think there are a lot of students who are first generation and things like that who have a much heavier weight. But I think almost all of us at some moment have felt like, am I supposed to be here? And the answer is yes.
Yeah, but then you show up, you show up at a place like Columbia, and there are actually a number of people who just absolutely feel like they should be there. And they've been told their entire life that they deserve to be there. And frankly, a lot of them aren't even that smart or that good at what they do. But they 100% feel entitled to be there.
Yeah, that's true.
No questions asked.
So you're entitled to be there too. So work on your feelings of entitlement, I guess.
Yeah, basically, I was talking to a friend of mine about this last night. We're like, you need to channel your inner entitled person.
That's true.
She wanted to ask for something, and the way she was asking for it, we're practicing, and we're like, no, that is not what you say. No, you do. No, you need to. She's like, but I can't say these things. Like, what you're saying sounds great, but like, we're like, channel the inner entitled person. Mm-hmm. So you are entitled to be there. You got in just like everybody else. And just channel that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a good point to end on. We're out of time. Good luck with your beginning of law school one-on-one experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You deserve to be there as much as anyone else.
Exactly. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Alison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.